Listen close, folks, because in these frozen plains and wind-swept hills, a single heartbeat can mean the difference between life and death. Imagine a young widow cradling her newborn twins against her chest, left for dead in a howling blizzard after ruthless men tore her world apart. The bitter cold bit into her flesh, hope flickering like a dying candle. Then out of the swirling snow, a Comanche hunter appeared, guided by the spirits or sheer chance. He bent down, saw the mother's trembling breath, and changed her fate in a single moment. This is her story, a Wild West saga of love, survival, and redemption. The winter of 1878 was nothing short of merciless. Snow draped the Texas panhandle in a silent, eerie hush, so thick it swallowed the ground beneath. The wind howled across the wide plains, stinging any exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. It was during this unforgiving season that Ella Mae Thompson, barely 22, found herself slumped against a ragged cottonwood trunk. She had traveled from a small settlement near Fort Griffin with her husband James Thompson, who had big dreams of starting a cattle ranch. They'd heard rumors that land was opening up near the Red River, cheaper than anywhere else in the territory. Possibilities, James had said, were endless. But James was gone now, struck down by 3 outlaws who ambushed them for what little silver they carried. Ella Mae had no choice but to run, stumbling on foot through the snow in the midst of labor pains. Hours passed in a delirious haze. When she could run no more, she collapsed, her body racked by contractions under the storm's brutal lash. Through sheer will and perhaps the grace of Providence, Ella Mae delivered twin daughters on that snowy ground. The excruciating pain, the freezing cold, and the shrieking wind nearly drowned her in despair. She tore strips of her own petticoat to swaddle the newborns. They shuddered and whimpered, small as sparrows, and dangerously silent. Exhausted and alone, Ella Mae clutched them to her chest, praying for a miracle. High above the moon, slid behind racing clouds, momentarily bathing her in a ghostly glow. Her face was streaked with tears that froze against her cheeks, and the weight of her grief bore down like a mountain. The blood in her veins felt sluggish and cold. She found it harder and harder to breathe. Yet somehow she refused to give up. She thought of James's bright grin, his promise that they'd find a good life somewhere along the frontier. She thought of the twins who deserved better than dying in the snow. With her fading strength, she pressed the babies close, whispering, "We will survive. I swear it." Then darkness claimed her. By the time Tuhuma, a young Comanche hunter who hailed from the band once led by the famed chief Quanah Parker, found Ella Mae in that glacial clearing, his keen eyes had already caught the faint shuffle of footprints, half hidden by swirling drifts. Tuhuma had left his own camp at the edge of the Llano Estacado in search of game, hoping to feed his small family through the rest of winter. He never expected to see a white woman lying in the snow, much less one who held 2 newborn infants. At first he thought she was dead. Her hair, honey blonde once, was plastered to her forehead, and her lips were a purplish hue. But when he knelt close, Tuhuma's breath hitched. A ghostly rise and fall stirred in her chest. The children, wrapped in pitiful rags, lay limply in her arms. The mother's eyelids fluttered, and a barely audible gasp escaped her lips. With practiced urgency, Tuhuma pulled a rolled buffalo hide from his horse's flank. The Comanche people knew all too well about survival in winter's harsh embrace. He gently lifted the woman and her babies, careful to keep them together for warmth, and wrapped them in the heavy hide. His horse, a sturdy, sure-footed Mustang named Bright Fang, snorted, and stomped the snow, sensing the urgency. He rode hard that night, guided more by instinct than sight, the swirling snow nearly blinding. He pressed on, determined to give this woman and her infants a fighting chance. Tuhuma's own mother had taught him that life was sacred, whether it be Comanche Kiowa settler or anyone in between. With the mothers you showed mercy. After several miles, he reached a small outcropping where his traveling companion, a fellow Comanche named Little Hawk, had raised a makeshift teepee for the night. Little Hawk's eyes widened when he saw Tuhuma approaching with a barely conscious woman and 2 newborns. At once they stoked the fire-added furs on the ground and placed mother and babies close to the warmth. In the flickering flames, Ella May stirred her cheeks, a ghostly pale. Yet her heart still fought. Tuhuma crouched beside her, pressing a water skin gently to her lips. She coughed. The babies whimpered. Though they were on the edge of oblivion, there was a spark. The first step toward survival had begun. 3 days passed in a blur for Ella May. Each time she floated to consciousness, she felt a roaring fire nearby and smelled the pungent aroma of herbs. She was vaguely aware of 2 men speaking in low, reassuring tones, their language foreign to her. When she could finally open her eyes and hold a thought, she found herself inside a small lodge made from tanned hides. Shadows danced on the walls as a fire crackled in the center. She felt stiff and sore, as though her bones had turned to ice. Instinctively, she looked for her children. The twins were nestled in separate bundles of hide, lying close to the fire where they soaked in the warmth. Their color was returning tiny fists, twitching with fragile life. At the sight of them, relief and gratitude swelled in her chest, so powerful it nearly shattered her. Then the wave of memory came, James's final moments. The outlaws, the snow, the desperate birth. She realized she was safe for now and that someone had saved her. Carefully she tried sitting up, wincing at the pain that lanced through her abdomen. Her voice was a dry rasp as she managed to call out, "Hello, who? Who is there?" Tuhuma rose from the far side of the fire. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, his hair braided and tied with leather cords. Around his neck hung a pendant carved from bone. His dark eyes held a gentle warmth, despite the wariness she knew existed between settlers and the Comanche. He said something in Comanche, then switched to broken English. "I am Tuhuma." "You hurt. Rest." Ella May's mouth trembled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "My babies," Liv Tuhuma said quietly. He crossed over to check on them, then brought her a steaming cup of herb-infused water. She drank slowly, each swallow soothing the rawness in her throat. He offered her a small bowl of something that smelled faintly of cooked venison. It tasted like a lifeline. Little Hawk, older and gruff, emerged, nodding at Ella May in acknowledgement. As the hours passed, Tuhuma explained in fragmented English how he'd found her. She told him her name haltingly, describing what had happened, though she could not yet speak of James's death without choking on grief. In that crude shelter on the vast and dangerous frontier, 2 strangers formed a bond under the watchful glow of flickering firelight. A week later, Ella May was strong enough to stand, though her muscles still quivered from the strain. She nursed her daughters, whom she had quietly named Hannah and Grace by the fire. The children were heartbreakingly small, but each day they grew stronger, letting out soft cries when hungry or cold. Tuhuma and Little Hawk made sure there was enough water and food. In turn, Ella May tried to tidy the lodge, even if her movements were slow. At night, nightmares plagued her. She saw James's face twisted in pain, blood seeping into the snow. She'd wake with a scream lodged in her throat, only to find Tuhuma's concerned gaze. He offered quiet comfort when words failed. On some nights, Little Hawk joined them chanting soft songs in Comanche. The songs rolled and flowed in a rhythmic hush that lulled Ella May back to a wary sleep. Gradually, she learned more about Tuhuma's life. He was from a small Comanche band that resisted relocation to the reservation near Fort Sill. Many had joined Quanah Parker and sought peace, but Tuhuma still roamed the old ways, hunting buffalo, trading hides where he could. Times were changing, though. The buffalo herds were thinning. The army was tightening control. Conflicts rose from broken treaties and the relentless push of settlers into Comanche land. It was a cruel irony. Ella May realized she was one of those settlers, though she had never meant to drive anyone off their home. She and James simply wanted a plot to call their own. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was keeping the twins alive and finding a shred of hope in a land marred by violence. As the blizzard subsided, Tuhuma and Little Hawk decided to move the camp closer to a trading post near the settlement of Fort Elliott. "Trade supplies," Tuhuma said. "Safer for babies, for you." Ella May felt torn about traveling deeper into frontier land, but she had no choice. With James gone and winter pressing down, she needed help, and she owed Tuhuma her life 100 times over. They packed up the small lodge, tying hides to their horses, while Ella May clutched her twins against her chest. Step by step, they moved across the wind-scoured plains. The snow glistened in the bright sun, forming icy crusts that cracked under hoof. Overhead, a hawk circled, as if bearing witness to the improbable sight of a young white widow and her Comanche rescuers, forging an alliance in a land where hatred often reigned supreme. The journey toward Fort Elliott tested Ella May's endurance more than she cared to admit. There were times she felt the raw sting of the wind tearing at her cheeks and wondered if she would ever feel warm again. Yet Tuhuma never pushed too hard. He scouted ahead, ensuring the path was safe, always returning with a calm nod or a quick shake of his head if he spotted danger. They followed the Canadian River's bend, using the trees along the water's edge for shelter when night fell. Sometimes they glimpsed half-frozen buffalo carcasses or wolf tracks in the snow. Once Ella May woke to the frantic crying of Hannah and Grace. She realized that a roving coyote had drawn close eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Before she could scream, Tuhuma appeared brandishing a bow and an arrow, sending the animal scampering into the shadows. Despite the hardships, Ella May's spirit refused to break. She thought of her twins, their tiny hands gripping her fingers, and remembered James's unwavering optimism. He used to say, "Hard times are just the valley before the mountain's peak. Keep climbing." So she kept climbing, one step, one breath at a time. Late one afternoon, the group encountered an unexpected sight. A stagecoach tilted on its side, half buried in snow near the banks of a frozen creek. Tuhuma circled around warily. Arrow knocked. Ella May peered through the swirling flakes and caught the glint of something metallic. Cautious steps brought them closer. No driver, no passengers, only the broken wheels and shattered trunk. Whatever had happened here, it was violent. Dried blood speckled the door. Ella May swallowed back a surge of fear. Could the same outlaws who killed James have done this? Tuhuma took a quick look around, rummaging for anything useful. He found a battered trunk with women's clothing, a few tins of food, and a small silver locket. Ella May held it in her palm, noticing a name engraved inside Martha Hill. Another tragedy. Another family shattered. It served as a grim reminder that out here the line between life and death was perilously thin. Ella May realized she might never find the outlaws who killed her husband, never see justice done. But she felt a stirring resolve. Perhaps she couldn't bring James back, but she could protect their children. With Tuhuma's help, she would survive, come what may. They arrived near Fort Elliott in the early evening. The wooden outpost sat on a gentle rise, and a scattering of cabins and tents formed a modest settlement around it. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant neighing of horses mingled with the low murmur of voices. Though it was hardly a bustling town, it was a lifeline in this wilderness. Ella May felt both relief and dread. Relief because civilization. Any civilization meant the promise of shelter and supplies. Dread because she knew how tense relations were between settlers and indigenous peoples. A Comanche approaching the fort might spark fear or even outright violence. Tuhuma understood the risk too. He halted some distance away, gesturing for Ella May to continue without him. "They not welcome me," he said carefully. The bitterness in his eyes spoke volumes about how often he and his people had been turned away, shot at, or demonized. Ella May's heart ached with gratitude and guilt. The man who saved her life and her twins might be in danger simply by approaching a settler outpost. She hesitated, not wanting to leave him to camp alone in the cold, but Tuhuma insisted. "I watch from far," he said. "If trouble, you wave." Little Hawk handed Ella May a small pouch of medicinal herbs. "For babies," he said in Comanche accented English. She nodded, hugging the medicine to her chest. "Thank you both," she whispered, tears in her eyes. I will return with help. I promise." Gathering her courage, Ella May trudged toward the settlement. She was greeted by wary stares. A lone figure trembling with 2 newborns bundled at her chest was a curious sight, but at least it didn't prompt immediate gunfire. A Union Army sergeant in a weathered coat stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Ma'am, are you all right? Where'd you come from in this storm?" "Ella." May swallowed hard. "My name is Ella May Thompson," she said. "I was robbed. My husband was killed. I need help. Shelter. My babies are just weeks old." The sergeant, whose name tag read Sergeant John Tolliver, eyed her in concern. His voice softened at the sight of the infants. "By God, miss, let's get you inside. We'll see about lodging." He glanced at the horizon, perhaps suspecting she hadn't traveled alone. But for now, he let it be. Fort Elliott's meager gates swung open, and Ella May stepped into a new chapter of her life, one fraught with fear, uncertainty, but also the faint glimmer of hope. Inside the fort's makeshift barracks, the warmth enveloped Ella May like a soothing blanket. Soldiers and a few civilians bustled about, bundling their coats against the wind. A woman who introduced herself as Clara Brown, a local nurse often hired by the army, hurried forward the moment she spotted the newborn twins. "Heaven's child, give them to me." "Oh, you poor things, come here," Clara said carefully, lifting the babies from Ella May's trembling arms. She checked their tiny faces, feeling their temperature. They're cold, but they're breathing all right. Ella May nearly collapsed with relief. Her legs shook from exhaustion. Sergeant Tolliver helped guide her to a wooden bench by the fire. Clara ordered a younger soldier to fetch heated water and blankets. "How long have you been out there?" Clara asked in a concerned hush. Ella May swallowed, glancing at the faces around her. Some stared with sympathy, others with suspicion. Days, she whispered. I lost track. My husband, he was shot by outlaws. I barely escaped. Clara's features softened. I'm so sorry. You're safe now. She began rubbing the baby's hands, cooing softly when their eyelids fluttered open. We'll warm them up, feed them, and see they get proper care. Sergeant Tolliver cleared his throat. We don't have much in the way of lodging for civilians, especially women with infants. But we'll figure something out. He gestured for a tall, broad-shouldered soldier next to him. Private Langford, see if the sutler's store has any spare infant supplies. Bottles, cloth, whatever we can get. Langford nodded and disappeared outside. As the hours passed, Ella May recounted her story to Sergeant Tolliver in a tremulous voice, how she and James had been heading west, the sudden ambush, his murder. She left out the part about Tuhuma and Little Hawk for the moment, unsure how the fort's residents would react. When she finished, the sergeant's brow furrowed. Ma'am, those outlaws, did you recognize them? We've had some trouble from a group led by a fella named Clyde Gibbons. They've robbed travelers along the roads, shot up a stagecoach last month. Ella May's breath caught. Could Gibbons be responsible for James's death? She shook her head. I didn't see them well. It was dark, snowing. But it could be. Please, I don't want them to hurt anyone else. She trailed off, tears pricking her eyes. Sergeant Tolliver exchanged a glance with Clara, then laid a hand gently on Ella May's shoulder. We'll do what we can. For now, rest. We'll see to you and your little ones. You have my word. Over the next few days, the fort's routine became something of a haven for Ella May. Clara Brown and another local woman, Mary Rodriguez, who did washing for the soldiers, helped her learn how to properly care for the twins in these cramped, makeshift conditions. Hannah and Grace seemed to sense the relative safety. Their wails were quieter, and they fed hungrily. The color crept back into their cheeks, yet while her babies recovered, Ella May remained torn. Tuhuma and Little Hawk were waiting outside in the cold. She felt obligated, no compelled, to return their kindness by ensuring they were not left abandoned. But how could she bring that up to the soldiers without endangering Tuhuma's life? On the third evening, while the sky darkened over the frontier, she mustered the courage to speak to Sergeant Tolliver. She found him in the fort's rudimentary office, studying a tattered map of the area. He looked up, eyebrows raised. Mrs. Thompson, come in. Everything all right, Ella? May swallowed hard. Sergeant, there's something I need to tell you. I didn't make it here on my own. She proceeded to explain how Tuhuma, the Comanche hunter, saved her in the snow, tended to her, and brought her to the outskirts of Fort Elliott. He risked his life, Sergeant. I owe him everything. He and his companion, Little Hawk. They're still out there camping by the river. I'm afraid they have no safe place to go. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. A Comanche rescued you. That's not something you hear every day, Ma'am. He rubbed the back of his neck. We've had tensions in this region, but if he truly meant no harm and saved your life... He let out a slow breath. Let me speak to Captain Beavers. He's in command here. Maybe we can arrange for them to come in under some form of truce, but I can't promise the men here will be welcoming. Some have lost friends in skirmishes. Ella May felt her stomach tighten. Please, Sergeant, He's a good man. If we show them trust, perhaps it'll start to mend. Some things. Tolliver nodded grimly, a spark of empathy in his eyes. We'll see, Mrs. Thompson. We'll see. Ella May left the office, her mind whirling with worry. She hoped Tuhuma would trust her enough to come in peacefully if the soldiers allowed it. Her debt to him weighed heavily on her heart, and she resolved to do whatever it took to repay the kindness he had shown when she was at her most vulnerable. 2 days later, under a cold morning sun, Sergeant Tolliver led a small detachment of soldiers out beyond the fort's boundaries. Ella May rode with them, bundled against the chill. In her arms, she carried a small basket containing a blanket, some rations and a beaded necklace she had painstakingly crafted from leftover thread and tiny trinkets gleaned from the fort. It was her meager offering to Tuhuma, a token of gratitude and respect. They followed the trail until they neared a stand of cottonwoods by the sluggish, partially frozen river. Tolliver raised a hand to halt the group. Through the branches they spotted 2 figures around a dim fire, Tuhuma and Little Hawk. Ella May's heart pounded. Would the soldiers remain calm? Would Tuhuma be wary? The Comanche men stood at once, hands drifting toward their weapons. Tuhuma recognized Ella May immediately. He called out in Comanche, a note of relief in his voice. She dismounted, carefully ignoring the tension bristling in the winter air. Tuhuma, she said, voice trembling but resolute. It's all right. These soldiers, I asked them to come. I want you to meet them. Tuhuma glanced from her to Sergeant Tolliver. Slowly, he relaxed his grip on his bow. Little Hawk, older and more suspicious, kept his eyes trained on the detachment's rifles. Tolliver stepped forward, one hand raised to show he meant no harm. My name's Sergeant John Tolliver Fort Elliott. We appreciate what you did for Mrs. Thompson. She told us you saved her life and her babies. A moment of stillness passed. Then Tuhuma nodded. He replied in halting English, She would die. Snow. Babies, too. He cast a glance at Ella May. There was warmth in his eyes, offset by the caution bred from years of conflict. Ella May drew closer, offering the basket. Please take these. It's not much, but I want you to have it. She lifted the necklace, showing him the beads arranged in a simple pattern. Tuhuma accepted it carefully as though it were a fragile piece of glass. A tiny smile ghosted across his lips. Sergeant Tolliver exhaled slowly. We'd like to invite you to stay near the fort where it's safer. Maybe we can come to some understanding. This land can be cruel in winter. No sense in letting good people or babies die out here. Tuhuma and Little Hawk exchanged a look. Finally, Tuhuma nodded. We come, but we watch. Ella May felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Perhaps there was room for trust and respect in this endless, unyielding frontier. The sight of Tuhuma and Little Hawk riding in behind the soldiers' detachment caused a stir at Fort Elliott. Some civilians and enlisted men gawked openly. A few spat in the dirt, muttering curses about savages. Others seemed merely curious. Ella May stood protectively beside Tuhuma, cradling one of the twins, as Sergeant Tolliver introduced him to a stern-looking officer, Captain Gerald Beavers. Captain Beavers, a gruff career soldier with a thick moustache, folded his arms over his chest. I don't like it, he said, eyeing the Comanche men. We've had trouble with raids along the Canadian River. How do we know these two aren't scouts for a larger war party? Ella May stiffened. They saved my life, Captain. My babies, too. They didn't have to, but they did. That should speak to their character. Beavers's jaw clenched, but he relented with a curt nod. I'll allow them to stay in the stables for a short time under guard. If they cause trouble, they won't, she insisted, ignoring the soldier's glare. Tuhuma watched her carefully, evidently picking up on the tension. He said nothing, but she suspected he understood more English than he let on. Thus began an uneasy coexistence. The fort's stables weren't comfortable, but Tuhuma and Little Hawk accepted the offer rather than remain in the bitter cold outside. Each day, they ventured out under watch, checking snares or hunting small game along the outskirts of the fort. Occasionally, they brought back a rabbit or a brace of quail, sharing it with Ella May and her twins. In turn, Ella May did her best to ease the suspicion. She taught Tuhuma basic phrases to help him communicate with soldiers. She also gleaned from him a few Comanche words, Taha for friend, Tubsai for thank you. Their bond, tenuous yet genuine, grew stronger with each gesture of trust. Clara Brown became one of their few allies. She was pragmatic but kind, helping dress Tuhuma's minor wounds from a barbed wire fence. You've got spunk, Mrs. Thompson, she told Ella May one afternoon. I'm not sure this place is ready for peaceful coexistence, but you're trying. That counts for something. Meanwhile, news trickled in of renewed bandit attacks. A stagecoach was found ransacked several miles away, and a local rancher reported stolen cattle. Sergeant Tolliver suspected Clyde Gibbons's gang, though no one knew where they holed up. Ella May's heart pounded each time she heard the name. If Gibbons was indeed responsible for James's murder, she yearned for justice. But how could she find it in a lawless frontier where the living had no guarantee of tomorrow? As winter's grip slowly loosened, the days at Fort Elliott settled into a tense routine. Ella May helped with odd jobs in the kitchen and laundry in exchange for a cramped bunk in a small shed. Hannah and Grace were never far from her sight. Clara Brown kept watch over the twins when Ella May was needed elsewhere, cooing and singing lullabies in a soft southern drawl. Tuhuma and Little Hawk made themselves useful hunting small game and sharing the meat. Some soldiers scoffed at the idea of receiving help from Comanches, but hunger could silence prejudices at least temporarily. A select few, like Private Langford, befriended Tuhuma after a successful hunt. They shared a wary camaraderie, conversing in broken English and gestures. One chilly afternoon, while returning from the river with fresh water, Ella May noticed a commotion near the fort's gates. She hurried closer, heart pounding, mindful of Hannah and Grace tucked in a sling around her body. The gates opened to reveal a small wagon escorted by two men on horseback. Their faces were grim, their clothes stained with dust and dried blood. She recognized one man as a local rancher named Samuel Wilcox. She'd seen him a few times at the fort. But her eyes widened at the second horseman, Marshal Bill Tilghman, a name she'd heard whispered with respect and fear. Tilghman was a federal marshal with a reputation for tracking down criminals who plagued the frontier. He had come and gone through Fort Elliott a few times over the last year. Captain Beavers emerged, greeting them stiffly. Marshal Tilghman Wilcox, what news do you bring? Wilcox dismounted, sorrow etched into his face. My ranch was hit last night. Stole 6 head of cattle, shot my stable hand. He didn't make it. His voice trembled with controlled fury. I'm done standing by. This Gibbons gang has to be stopped. Tilghman nodded. We followed their trail a ways. They're hiding somewhere along the Palo Duro Canyon, I suspect. Then his gaze fell on Ella May, the twins, and the 2 Comanche men standing nearby. Curiosity flickered in his steely eyes, but he didn't comment yet. Ella May felt her pulse spike at the mention of Gibbons. This was the man who had shattered her life. Could it be that justice was finally drawing near? Captain Beavers beckoned Tilghman inside. "We'll plan our next move. If we can muster enough men, we'll ride out and see this settled once and for all." Ella May stood by, clutching her children close. For the first time since James's death, she felt a spark of hope and a flicker of fear. If a confrontation with Gibbons was coming, it could bring vengeance or tragedy, and she was no stranger to how quickly the scales could tip in the untamed West. That evening, while the fort's lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls, Ella May found herself summoned to Captain Beavers's office. She tried to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach as she crossed the threshold and saw Marshal Tilghman leaning against a desk, arms folded, studying her with a level gaze. Sergeant Tolliver stood off to one side, face set in a slight frown. Captain Beavers gestured for her to sit. "Mrs. Thompson, the marshal here, wants to hear your story regarding these outlaws who attacked you." Ella May settled into the chair, carefully adjusting her twins. Their warm bodies were a comforting weight against her. She recounted the brutal night once more, James's fatal wound, the outlaw's taunts, the raging storm. She tried to recall any detail of their leader, his voice, his clothes. "He had a scar along his jaw," I think she said softly. "Wore a thick jacket. They spoke about meeting someone named Braxton. I'm not certain it was all a haze." Tilghman's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "A scarred jaw sounds like Clyde Gibbons. We've heard that name Braxton around here too. Maybe a fence or an accomplice. Based on your description, it aligns with the group we suspect." He glanced at Captain Beavers. "We need to move soon before they slip away again." Beavers nodded. "We'll gather volunteers. The army can't spare a large detachment right now, but I'll authorize some men to go. Wilcox will join. He's got a stake in this." He turned his gaze back to Ella May. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry for your loss. You'll have your chance at justice if we can catch them." Ella May's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking rapidly to hold back tears. "James deserved better. And I don't want these outlaws taking more lives." After she left the office, Tuhuma found her near the stables. He seemed concerned, noticing her trembling hands. "Trouble?" he asked quietly. She explained as best she could the plan to hunt down Gibbons, the hopes of ending his reign of terror. Tuhuma listened, then nodded resolutely. "I help," he said, pressing a hand to his chest. He pointed toward the horizon. "Find outlaws. They took your man. Not good." Ella May was taken aback. "That's not your fight," she began. But Tuhuma shook his head. "Your babies, no father. Tuhuma help." His expression was unwavering, an unspoken loyalty bridging the gulf between them. She placed her hand over his. "Thank you," she murmured. I don't have the words to express how much that means." In the silent hush of a frontier night, their alliance grew stronger, an unlikely bond forged by compassion, tested by violence, and on the verge of facing its greatest challenge yet. The posse rode out just after dawn, their silhouettes cutting sharp lines against the pale morning sky. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the creaking of saddles and soft whinnies of restless horses echoed across the courtyard. Marshal Tilghman led the group, his weathered face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Beside him rode Sergeant Tolliver Jaw, clenched his rifle tied tight against his saddle. Ella May stood by the fort's gates, Hannah and Grace swaddled in her arms. Her shawl flapped in the wind, and though the babies stirred in their sleep, she remained still watching. Her heart beat in her throat. The sight of the men setting off stirred a quiet storm of hope and dread in her chest. James's killer could finally face justice. But the risk, the thought of more death, more blood, it twisted her stomach. Tuhuma rode just behind Tilghman, his face calm but focused. He wore a bone pendant around his neck and carried his bow across his back alongside a newly repaired rifle from the fort's storehouse. Little Hawk rode slightly to his left, silent and ever watchful. The other volunteers, Samuel Wilcox, still stiff from the wound he'd taken before Private Langford, and 2 grizzled ranchers from a nearby homestead, formed a small but determined force. 8 men against an unknown number. Clara Brown stood beside Ella May, resting a hand gently on her arm. "They'll bring them to justice," she whispered. "Gibbons and the rest. It's time." Ella May nodded her eyes, never leaving the horizon, as the riders shrank into the distance. She wanted to believe Clara. She needed to. But memories of the ambush still clung to her like smoke. James's blood on the snow, the leering faces of the outlaws, her own helpless cries, swallowed by the storm. The next few days passed in a haze of anxious waiting. Ella May buried herself in routine. She washed soldiers' linens, helped Clara prepare meals, and cared for the twins with single-minded devotion. When she bathed them in warm water by the firelight, or hummed lullabies passed down from her mother, her thoughts wandered. She imagined what James might say now. Would he be proud of her strength? Would he weep to see her standing alone? Each night she prayed quietly, fervently. For Tuhuma's safety. For justice. For the courage to keep going, no matter what returned through those gates. By the 4th day, her nerves were raw. Snowflakes had started falling again, and the sky hung low and grey with tension. That evening, just as the first lanterns were lit around the fort's perimeter, the sound of hooves reached them, distant at first, then growing louder. Ella May rushed outside, nearly stumbling as she cradled the twins against her. Clara followed close behind. Soldiers emerged from their posts, gathering near the gates, hopeful and wary. The posse returned through the gates, riding slowly, their bodies slouched with exhaustion. Marshal Tilghman's coat was torn dust, and blood smeared across one shoulder. Sergeant Tolliver had a fresh cut above his right eyebrow, crusted dark against his pale skin. Samuel Wilcox was barely upright in the saddle, one arm hanging limp, a crimson patch soaking his shirt. But it was Tuhuma that Ella May searched for first, and when she saw him, her heart clenched. He was there, alive. His left arm was tightly bandaged, blood leaking through the linen, but he held his reins steady and nodded when he met her gaze. Relief washed over her so violently that her knees buckled. Tilghman dismounted, walking over to Captain Beavers, who had stepped out to meet them. His voice was low, gravelly with fatigue. "We found them. Gibbons and his gang were holed up in a ravine just west of Palo Duro. They didn't surrender." Gibbons Beavers asked. Dead Tilghman said flatly. 3 others captured. 2 got away in the chaos. But we don't expect them to last long in that canyon. We lost 2 of ours. Wilcox took a bullet through the side, but he'll live if we're lucky. Beavers nodded grimly, then looked to the rest of the men, giving each a small, solemn gesture of acknowledgement. "You did what needed doing." Ella May stepped forward, swallowing hard. Her voice trembled as she asked Marshall, "Is it true Gibbons is gone?" Tilghman's eyes softened. "It's true, ma'am. I'm sorry for your loss, but the man who took your husband is no longer a threat to anyone." She blinked back tears. The world didn't suddenly feel safer. James was still gone. But something shifted inside her, something she hadn't felt in weeks, a fragment of peace, a small return of power. Tuhuma approached her quietly. She saw the pain in his face, the way he moved stiffly. "You're hurt," she said, brushing her fingers over the bloodied cloth. He gave a slight shrug. "Not deep, just angry skin." A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "We did it." Ella May's eyes welled. She placed one hand gently over his bandage and whispered, "Thank you for bringing justice to James, for coming back." He nodded, saying nothing more. There was no need. As the sun dipped behind the fort and the air turned colder once again, Ella May turned back toward the barracks. She looked over her shoulder at the men still dismounting, the quiet respect in their movements, the fatigue of battle hanging heavy on their shoulders. The frontier had claimed much, but in this moment it had given her something to justice. And with that came the faint but growing hope of a future not defined by fear, but by strength. In the days following the posse's return to Fort Elliott, a heavy quiet settled over the outpost like a blanket of snow yet to melt. On the surface, life returned to its usual rhythm, boots crunching in the frost, soldiers drilling livestock, braying, but underneath a weight lingered. 2 men had died hunting down the Gibbons gang, and their absence was felt in every meal bell that rang without them. The funeral procession was small but heartfelt. Rough-hewn coffins were laid to rest beneath the shelter of cottonwoods outside the fort, and the somber murmurs of prayer drifted through the chilled air. Ella May attended the service, her twins bundled in her arms, their small bodies tucked beneath woolen wraps. She didn't know the fallen men well, but she knew what their sacrifice had meant. Justice for James, safety for her daughters. It was a debt she could never repay, yet one that bound her forever to this place. Tuhuma's injury, a gash torn across his upper arm during the firefight in Palo Duro Canyon, was healing slowly. The wound required daily cleaning, and Ella May took it upon herself to tend it. Clara Brown guided her through the process, how to use willow bark tea to ease the swelling, how to wrap the bandages so the flesh wouldn't stiffen. Tuhuma never once complained, though his brow sometimes knit in pain. When she pressed the poultice too hard, he merely murmured, "I've had worse." Little Hawk, meanwhile, remained elusive. He often disappeared for a day or 2 at a time, returning with strips of smoked meat or fresh herbs tucked into leather satchels. He spoke little, but Ella May noticed the way he paced at night like a caged animal, uneasy among walls and strangers. Life inside the fort was not made for warriors who once roamed the plains freely, and she could see that the walls were closing in on both him and Tuhuma. One afternoon, golden light poured across the parade ground as the sun began its slow descent. Ella May stood on the ramparts above the gates, the twins resting in a wide basket behind her, their soft coos a gentle counterpoint to the low wind. Her eyes scanned the distant horizon, where pale grasses swayed like ocean tides. A strange ache filled her chest. Not sadness, not quite, just the sense that the future was shifting again, calling to her. Tuhuma joined her in silence, his presence grounding. He stood beside her for a long while, saying nothing before finally lifting his chin toward the west. "Spring come soon," he said, his voice low. "Buffalo move again. Time for us to go." Ella May's heart thudded. She knew what he meant. The Comanche couldn't stay at the fort indefinitely, not with whispers behind every door and cold stares that never warmed. "You're leaving?" she asked, voice barely audible. He nodded slowly. "Little Hawk say, stay too long. Not our way." His dark eyes flicked to hers. You and babies. You stay." She looked away, unsure of her answer. The fort had given her shelter, yes, but it had not given her peace. Not truly. There were always watchful eyes, curious murmurs about her, and the Comanche warrior who had saved her life. And though Captain Beavers had allowed their presence, he did so with the tight-jawed tolerance of a man just waiting for a reason to revoke it. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've thought about heading east, but there's no one left for me there, and I can't raise my girls in fear." She turned toward him fully. "Where would you go?" Tuhuma's expression softened. "My people, some stay near Fort Sill. Quannaparker's band. They try peace now. Live different, not like old times. Maybe you could come." The idea struck her like thunder, foreign and bold. A white woman alone with twin daughters living among a Comanche band. It would be unthinkable to most, dangerous, some would say. But when she looked at Tuhuma, she didn't see danger. She saw the man who had carried her through the snow, who had fought for her husband's justice, who had kept her daughters alive when all the world seemed set on taking them. "I don't belong anywhere anymore," she whispered. "Not here. Not back east. But maybe I could belong somewhere new." Tuhuma nodded once. "You strong. You make your place." She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with the beginnings of tears. "I'll think on it. But I trust you. That counts for something." The sun dipped lower, and a hawk soared high above them, its wings spread wide against the sky. Ella May watched it glide silently, a lone shape chasing the wind. Somewhere in that quiet moment she understood what she needed, not just safety, but a life worth living. Not just survival, but freedom. She placed a hand gently on Tuhuma's arm. "If I go with you, it won't be easy." "No," he said simply. "But it will be honest." Together they stood on the edge of the fort's world, gazing out toward the vast, uncertain plains. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a new chapter waited, not written yet, but ready to be forged in footsteps, decisions, and the unbreakable will of a mother determined to build a future from the ashes of her past. Ella May stood at the gates of Fort Elliott, the prairie wind tugging at the hem of her worn dress. A humble wagon rested beside her, hitched to an aging mule and modestly loaded with all she owned. Bundles of cloth diapers, 2 patched wool blankets, a cracked mirror, and a small wooden trunk filled with the last keepsakes from her life with James. His worn Bible, a silver wedding band, and a faded photograph of them smiling before the journey west. Her eyes lingered on the fort's walls, knowing it might be the last shelter she'd see for many miles. Behind her, the twins, now nearly 2 months old, slept bundled together in a lined basket, resting on the wagon's plank seat. Their soft breathing was a steady rhythm against the uncertainty pounding in her chest. She turned startled slightly as Clara Brown stepped out from the barracks, cradling a small jar wrapped in muslin. "You be careful out there." Ella? May? Clara said, pressing the jar into her hands. It's salve for the little ones. Helps with rashes, chafing. Even keeps the bugs away come summer. Her face was tight with concern, but her voice was warm. You're tougher than most folks who come through these gates. Don't let this land change that. Ella May clutched the jar to her chest and swallowed the knot in her throat. Thank you, Clara. For the medicine, and for being kind. A moment later, Sergeant Tolliver approached, removing his cap out of respect. Mrs. Thompson, he said solemnly, you've endured what most couldn't, and you did it with your head high. I hope you know if you ever find yourself this way again, you'll have a place here. He glanced over at Tuhuma, who stood beside his Mustang. Bright Fang, adjusting the leather straps on his saddle. Him too, Tolliver added after a beat, if I have any say in it. Ella May offered a faint but genuine smile. Thank you, Sergeant. You gave us a chance. That means everything. In the background, Captain Beavers watched with arms folded, his ever-stern expression cracking only slightly. There was no speech from him, just a sharp nod, as if he too recognized the quiet strength of the woman before him. Marshal Tilghman had already left days earlier on another pursuit of justice, as was his way. But his absence didn't dim the sense that something final, something irrevocable was shifting. This fort had become a chapter in her story, one marked by sorrow, resilience, and unlikely alliances. Tuhuma led his horse beside the wagon and gave her a small nod. Ready. She looked at him not just a man anymore, but the symbol of everything she had survived. She cast a final glance at the people who had become a strange kind of community, Clara with her gentle hands and fierce heart, Sergeant Tolliver with his quiet integrity, even Captain Beavers, who had come to tolerate the unthinkable, a white woman choosing to ride beside a Comanche. Ella May drew in a long breath of crisp morning air. She could stay at the fort, yes. She might even find work or a sympathetic widow's charity from one of the churches. But it would be a half-life, a guarded one. The whispers would never stop. The stares would never soften. But the Comanche lands near Fort Sill held something else, a new beginning. One shaped not by pity or survival, but by choice. A place where she could raise her girls to be strong, to respect the land, to understand both sides of a divided world. She stepped up onto the wagon and took the reins gently. Let's go. As they moved past the gates, the soldiers and settlers watched in silence, some with awe, some with judgment, others with quiet hope. The sight of a widow with twin babies and a Comanche warrior beside her wasn't something they'd forget soon. Bright Fang trotted beside the wagon, his steps easy and sure. Tuhuma rode beside Ella May, silent but steady. Little Hawk had already scouted ahead at dawn, wary of the dangers still lurking on the horizon. The wagon creaked across the plain's wheels, cutting soft tracks into the thawing earth. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and blue, the clouds drifting lazily, as if unconcerned by the weight of history unfolding below. Ella May looked down at her daughters, their cheeks flushed with warmth and life. She adjusted their blanket and whispered, "We're going to make it, one way or another." As they rode away from Fort Elliott and into the unknown, she felt no fear, only purpose. She was no longer the broken widow who had collapsed in the snow. She was a mother, a survivor, and a woman who had forged an unbreakable bond with someone she had once been taught to fear. The Texas plains stretched before them, dangerous, beautiful, unclaimed. It was a road few dared to travel. But Ella Mae Thompson had already faced death and defied it. Now she rode toward life. Thus ends the tale of Ella Mae Thompson, the struggling widow who birthed her twins in a howling blizzard and found salvation in the most unlikely ally, a Comanche hunter named Tuhuma. From heartbreak to survival, from sworn vengeance to a fragile peace, her journey is a testament to courage, compassion, and the surprising bonds that can form on the untamed frontier. But the West never rests, and neither do its stories. Perhaps Ella Mae's next chapter unfolds in open grasslands, or perhaps she finds shelter among Tuhuma's people. One thing is certain, her perseverance in the face of impossible odds is a reminder that love and hope can flourish even in the harshest conditions. If this story moved you, dear friends, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. There are many more Wild West sagas waiting to be told, and your support helps keep these legends alive for generations to come. Thank you for listening.